Chapter 11. A Devil of a Row Aft. Daniel had been giving evidence for nearly 5 hours. Now it was Captain Dewar's turn. White-gloved and wearing his sword, it was not time yet for him to surrender it to the court. He took his place before the long table. Fortunately for authority, now extremely anxious to get the trials out of the way, his evidence was comparatively brief. He gave his version of Collard's behaviour at the dance, and said that the Admiral became so excited at one stage that he had to suggest to him that it was neither the time nor the place to have a discussion, and, in an attempt to cut Collard short, he edged away. In the Admiral's day cabin afterwards, he had said to Collard, "I want to talk to you about threatening me on the quarterdeck last night in the presence of the guests." Dewar was not allowed to continue his description of the interview because the Deputy Judge Advocate objected that Daniel had not been present. He went on to confirm Daniel's story of the discussion in the cabin when all three had been together. He added that Collard swore on his honour that he had never used the word bugger. Dewar said that when Daniel was first appointed to the ship, he was told that his most important duty was to keep in touch with the petty officers and master-at-arms and other subordinates so that he could give his captain an accurate picture of the discipline and state of the ship. He added that Daniel's methods had a very great effect on Royal Oak. When he had first arrived, the ship was outwardly efficient, but, in the captain's opinion, and in some ways, she was a dead ship. Daniel had entirely altered the situation in a couple of months. The men became much happier, and the officers keener, and the ship generally more efficient. In cross-examination, he replied that he thought Daniel's letter was entirely in accordance with his orders. He did not agree that it criticised the Admiral. Instead, it remarked on the effect of the Admiral's conduct on the ship. He did not think that Daniel's phrase, "in anticipation of vindictive fault-finding," was a criticism of the Admiral. It was an attempt to show the effect of his conduct. He thought that the dance incident would have badly affected morale and discipline if Daniel had not acted as he had. The prosecutor: "Were you yourself apprehensive about the forthcoming inspection of the ship by the Admiral?" Dewar: "I really did not think much about it. If I had, I should not have been apprehensive. I should have expected, in view of these incidents, one might get rather a rough time." In further cross-examination, Dewar said that Collard had been wearing uniform when he came aboard Royal Oak from his barge. He had not saluted the quarterdeck. Daniel had not been appointed to the ship by the Admiralty, but at the request of Collard and Dewar. Collard had applied at Dewar's request. The next witness was number Royal Marine Bandsman 1413, Bandmaster First Class Percy Edward Barnacle. He stated that on the night of the dance the band had played one tune which had received an encore, and the band had just played it again, and the applause died down when the Admiral beckoned to him with his finger and at the same time approached the bandstand. The Admiral said, "Come here, you bugger. Call yourself a flagship's bandmaster?" Then he added, "I will have you sent home. I have never heard such a bloody noise in all my life. Can't you play dance music? In any case, I will report you. Now go and see if you can do better." Barnacle: "I replied to the Admiral, 'I will do my very best, sir.'" That interruption, added the bandmaster, caused a slight delay in the programme. The band played one more number. Then Barnacle took them below. The instruments were taken to the band room, and there 2 or 3 bandsmen asked Barnacle if it was in order for them to put in a request to leave the ship. At this point, the Deputy Judge Advocate stopped the bandmaster from giving any more hearsay evidence. Then came the question that Barnacle had been dreading. Kimball paused, looked at him hard, and then asked, "In your opinion, how was the band playing that evening?" The bandmaster waited even longer before, and still, stiffly at attention, he gave the well-rehearsed answer, "Just as well as usual, sir." He had obviously tucked any thoughts of his alcoholic cornetist well into the back of his mind. Barnacle's relief, the subject was changed. He told the court that sometime later he was taken before Commander Daniel, who said that the Admiral had offered an apology through him. The Deputy Judge Advocate intervened. "Did you make any request to your superior officer the morning following the dance in regard to the incident? If so, what were the terms of this request?" Barnacle: "The terms of the request were that I requested to leave the service." Then the President followed the line of questioning. "Why?" he asked. "Did you want to leave the service?" The bandmaster replied, "In view of my past recommendations from flag officers, The situation was that I was distracted by being spoken to in such a manner. Light comedy arrived with the next witness. Number Royal Marine Bandsman 1445, musician Walter Guerin, who played the cornet in Royal Oak's band. He contradicted his bandmaster by saying that they had played 2 encores to a dance just before the Admiral approached. The Admiral beckoned to Barnacle, and Guerin heard him say, come here, you bugger," and pointed to the deck before him. It was not the evidence suddenly had the 9 senior officers of the court laughing uncontrollably, but Guerin's masterly imitation of Collard's voice and manner. It took quite a while for that hangar aboard HMS Eagle to come to order and resume its solemnity. Commander Melby Brownlow was then called. He was Navigation Commander of Royal Oak and, being the senior commander on board, was also President of the Wardroom Mess. In that latter capacity, he said he was responsible for the conduct and behaviour of the officers in that mess, and consequently felt it necessary to know what was going on. He had been ashore on the night of the dance, but Daniel came to him later with his letter and asked if the facts he had stated with regard to the feelings of the wardroom were correct. Brownlow told the court, "I felt very strongly that the whole world ought to know that we resented the incident which had taken place on board." The prosecutor: "Do you really believe it to be in the interests of the service that the whole world should be told of this affair?" Brownlow hesitated for quite a while before he answered, "Yes." "You still hold that opinion today?" "Yes, certainly." Brownlow was followed by Royal Oak's First Lieutenant and Gunnery Officer, Lieutenant Commander George O'Donnell. He gave evidence that, very soon after Daniel had been appointed to the ship, he sent for the First Lieutenant to his cabin, and gave an order that he was to be kept informed of the opinions of the lower deck and wardroom in matters affecting the morale of the crew. Daniel added that anything said in his cabin would go no further, and that if he did not want to hear what O'Donnell had to tell him, he would stop him. Soon after that, O'Donnell did have occasion to put these instructions into effect. On the Saturday after the dance, he sought up Daniel in his cabin. It was about 9 o'clock in the evening. O'Donnell said to the commander, "I would like to see you privately, sir. The matter I want to see you about is concerning the incident of the dance on Thursday night. I think you should know that the whole matter of the incident that occurred is being discussed in Malta. When I got home last night, my wife told me." Daniel's answer was that they must do their very best to stop the rumours. He said he relied on O'Donnell as First Lieutenant to stop wardroom chatter. O'Donnell had replied that he could not be responsible for dealing with the 3 stripers in the mess, for they were so indignant about the events at the dance that he was certain they would not listen to him, but he would do all he possibly could with officers junior to him. On the 5th of March, the day the Admiral went ashore in his barge, there had been trouble on the forecastle with a jammed cable. When it was cleared, O'Donnell went down to the wardroom to report the fact. As he entered the anteroom, he heard someone among a group of officers say, "There was a devil of a row aft." A few days later, he was asked to go to Daniel's cabin. 2 other lieutenant commanders were already there. Daniel told him to shut the door and then said he had sent for the ship's lieutenant commanders as he thought that they represented the opinion of the wardroom better than anyone else. Then Daniel announced very seriously indeed, "I have committed myself," and proceeded to read out extracts from a typewritten sheet on the desk before him. O'Donnell remembered phrases such as, "Among wardroom officers, those who had the mortifying experience of witnessing these scenes are inflamed with anger and deeply resentful of the humiliation," and "My recent appeals look forward to the inspection, thereby making it serve a useful purpose for the efficiency of the service, has been reversed by the anticipation of vindictive fault-finding." Daniel then begged the 3 officers, "If I have, in any case, overstated the case, for God's sake, stop me." The 3 lieutenant commanders reflected and then assured him that he had not. O'Donnell told the court that he still thought the letter was a fair representation of the wardroom's feelings. When the prosecutor got to his feet and started his cross-examination, he soon found himself wallowing in technicalities about jammed anchor cables. Both prosecutor and witness were happily involved in discussing probable causes and explanations for the jamming, and the impatient court put a stop to things and declared they would have no more questions along these lines. In further cross-examination, O'Donnell said that by 6th March, the day the Admiral returned on board, he had given up attempting to stop wardroom chatter. He heard it among senior officers as well as juniors, but he took no notice. Apart from that, he had no time to check such conversations. Prosecutor: "You had time to listen to it, but not to check it. I heard it, but I did not say I listened to it. The questioning turned to the day of the Court of Inquiry and the occasions when Daniel had started to read out the captain's letter to the wardroom officers. In his answers, O'Donnell stoutly denied that he was disgusted at such behaviour, nor was he taken aback. He had even read out part of it himself while the commander was sent for by Dewar. He disagreed that it was not fit hearing for the junior officers present. In his view, it was the only way to collect witnesses. Lieutenant Commander Archie Murray, the second senior lieutenant commander aboard Royal Oak, was sworn in. Technically, he was Daniel's assistant. He described what he called the intense indignation in the wardroom on the Friday and Saturday following the dance. He had also been in charge of the main derrick on the occasion when the Rear Admiral returned in his barge. His orders from Daniel were to hoist that barge inboard once Collard had quitted it. It was here that Kimball, who was examining him, either pressed too hard or showed his lack of knowledge of the subject. "What do you say," he asked, "as to the suitability of weather conditions for hoisting the barge inboard on that occasion?" Murray answered bluntly, "I would have preferred not to." In an effort to retrieve the situation and to remove any suspicion that Collard's mood that day had some justification, Kimball went on to ask, "Could it have been done?" Murray answered that it could. By the time another witness had been heard in, it was 7 o'clock and the end of another long day in the carrier's hangar. All idea that the trials would be swiftly dealt with and the pleasant prospects of a quick start to the spring cruise had disappeared. After 2 days, Daniel's case was not even over, and there was still more evidence to come. Strong evidence it was too. Promptly at 9:30 the next morning, Major Claude Atwood strode forward to give evidence. From the night of the dance he had been an angry critic of the Rear Admiral and his behaviour. Nothing was going to persuade him that Collard's action had not been a grave slur on the Royal Marines that he commanded aboard Royal Oak. He told the court that on the day of the dance he had been in camp ashore with a machine gun party. He had returned to the ship especially for the dance. During the evening he had heard an angry voice and had seen Collard shaking his hand at the band and talking loudly. Atwood said he had wanted to intervene then, but his dancing partner had checked him. There was no question of it being a trifling, unnoticed incident. According to Atwood, everyone was standing around and watching. There was a large number of people, and they were all staring. After the dance, he had returned to the camp ashore and did not rejoin Royal Oak until about noon 2 days later. Immediately he set foot on board his second in command, met him on the quarterdeck, and told him that Bandmaster Barnacle had asked to be relieved from the band. Had Barnacle's original request gone through, he would have forfeited 17 pensionable years' service. Atwood smartly sought out Daniel and told him he wished to protect against what he considered to be a reflection on his corps and himself. "I made it pretty clear to him," Atwood told the court, "that I felt very indignant about it. As far as he was concerned, he was prepared to leave things in the captain's hands and, should any further action take place, he was prepared to support it." Later, Daniel told him the Admiral had apologised. Atwood said he was prepared to accept this, but only on the condition that if any other incident concerning Collard occurred, then he would bring this matter up again. Daniel said that the Admiral would be having a drink in the wardroom. Atwood added that he intended just to be at the closing of the incident. After Collard had left, Atwood heard Daniel say that no further reference was made to the events at the dance. But shortly afterwards, whilst he was having a wardroom drink with Daniel and another officer, Atwood said he made a comment about the Admiral. Daniel promptly left them, went to the quarterdeck, and sent for the Major and warned him about making such remarks. Kimball: "Was that a casual or formal conversation?" Atwood: "Distinctly formal." The Major went on to tell the court that he agreed with the phrase in Daniel's letter stating, "Among wardroom officers, those who had the mortifying experience of witnessing these scenes are inflamed with indignation, and all officers are deeply resentful." It was a fair description of the attitude of the wardroom. There seemed to be a certain amount of feeling that if something were not done, then there would be trouble in the ship. Atwood added, "I myself heard remarks such as, 'What is the good of doing anything? The Admiral is never pleased.'" After the departure of the stubborn and indignant Major, the court had at last arrived at the closing speeches. They made a most dissimilar pair. Dave Kimball, in his black jacket and pinstripe trousers, forever hitching up the shoulders of his gown, appearing for defence, and Captain Thomas Calvé, DSO, for the prosecution, in his frock coat, sword belt, braid, and medals. Kimball, with his East Coast American accent, Calvé's, in contrast, as English as a public school and the Navy could make it. Yet both found themselves united in arguing intensely over the rights and wrongs of a matter that, in its origins, would hardly amount to much more than a ripple at a golf club dance. But now senior officers' careers were at stake. Put briefly and simply, but alas, to the chagrin of the 9 members of the court, weary in their seats, Kimball was neither brief nor simple. The defence was as follows. In answer to the first 2 charges, Daniel had no idea, when he was ordered by the captain to explain the reasons for the Admiral's dissatisfaction with the arrangements for the accommodation ladder, that it would ever go beyond the captain, and if, while writing his letter, he had expressed his concern about the Admiral's effect on the ship's morale and discipline, to whom else could the officer most concerned on such subjects write, save to his own captain? When Daniel realised that his letter was being sent forward to the Admiral, he had at least made the effort of checking with the more senior officers in the wardroom that it was justified. As for the 3rd and 4th charges, Daniel had no option but to read any letter of complaint aloud to junior officers in the wardroom, given the extremely brief time he had to secure witnesses for the court of inquiry. Kimball agreed that in one respect the incidents leading to the court-martial were farcical. Never had there been a storm in a tinier teacup. But for his client, the outcome was grave. For the Royal Navy too. If Daniel was found guilty, then any officer would be convinced that any complaint he made, however justified, could only result in punishment for himself. Calvé was shorter, much shorter. He argued thus. When Daniel realised his letter was to be forwarded to the Admiral, with all its insubordinate remarks, he had ample time to withdraw it. Instead, he consulted other officers and they made sure it went forward. Daniel's argument was that he had written it for the good of the ship and her morale and discipline. But apart from a few third-hand wardroom remarks, the defence had produced no evidence at all that Royal Oak was in any way an unhappy ship. As for reading the letters aloud in the wardroom, in order to secure witnesses, surely some simple, unsubversive way could easily have been found. Merely detailing officers who had been present at the various incidents would have been enough. There was no shadow of doubt in Calvé's mind that Commander Daniel was guilty on all 4 charges. There was a sudden clamour of warning bells high up on the bulkhead of the hangar. The great armour-plated door slowly started to creep shut as witnesses, lawyers, spectators and pressmen were herded away beyond them. The court was about to decide on its verdict. Half an hour elapsed before those steel doors were reopened. Daniel marched in, escorted by his guardian officer. Behind them filed an anticipatory audience. Daniel had to approach the baize-covered table from an angle. As he neared it, he turned his head anxiously to his left in order to catch a glimpse of his unsheathed sword. Its point was towards him. It told him all he needed to know. He had been found guilty on at least 1 charge. It turned out to be very much worse than that. The Deputy Judge Advocate rose to his feet and announced that all the charges against the accused had been proved. He held a single sheet of hand-written paper. It bore the signatures of the 9 members of the board. They were all in unison. Proceedings then took on a form familiar in any civilian court. Daniel was to be given the opportunity to plead in mitigation of the sentence that was surely coming. He was asked if he wished to hand in his certificates, those vital documents recording a naval officer's career and his various superiors' comments. Because of his long service, the accused was able to produce a considerable sheaf. One by one, they were solemnly read out, right from the time, 23 years before, when he was serving as a midshipman in HMS Bulwark. His captain's report on him then was that he had served with sobriety, zeal, and attention, and ended, "This officer's abilities are of a very high order." According to the Times, the list went on to sound like an illustrious roll call. Lord Nelson, Isis, Albion, Duncan, Calliope, Royalist, Dauntless, Valiant, and Barham. All the reports were highly favourable, including one from a Vice-Admiral. At least 2 of them spoke of his tact in dealing with other officers. Strangely, one comment made 12 years earlier, when he was serving as a lieutenant in Vivid, for a brief few weeks was signed by Dewar as his commanding officer. It declared that Daniel was a zealous gunnery officer. The prosecution told the court that it could not produce any evidence that Daniel had ever been censured before and stated that he had never been court-martialed. Daniel was asked if he wished to address the court in mitigation of his defence or call any character witnesses. He declined. The bulkhead bells clattered again, the hangar was cleared, and the court was left to decide Daniel's punishment. When the trial reopened, all the witnesses lined up formally behind the President and faced Daniel. Only Rear Admiral Collard had chosen to be absent. The sentence was stern. Daniel was to be dismissed his ship and severely reprimanded. The only worse penalty he could have incurred would to have been dismissed the service, but the practical results were very much the same. At a time when the Navy was economising and saving every penny it could, there would be little room for a commander with such a blot on his record. Incidentally, the ship from which Daniel was formally dismissed was HMS Cormorant, a small and ancient sloop now lending her name to the headquarters of the Rear Admiral in charge, Gibraltar. A naval officer could never be without his ship, even if it was something of a charade. So when Collard and his two subordinates had been removed from Royal Oak, they had found themselves borne on Cormorant's books. As Daniel and his small party made their disconsolate way ashore and to the hotel, another naval occasion was also ending in something much like a disaster on that very same day. The Atlantic fleet had left Gibraltar in a hurry to be reviewed at Portland by King Amunallah of Afghanistan. The morning had dawned grey and overcast. A few hours later, heavy and ceaseless rain swept across the harbour. Outside, more than half a gale was blowing. Still, the Atlantic fleet put to sea before noon and was soon joined by the royal barge, rolling and pitching in the broken waves. The King of Afghanistan, accompanied by the Duke of York, later to be King George VI, carefully mounted the heaving accommodation ladder of the fleet flagship, HMS Nelson. The Queen of Afghanistan and her court had, at the very last moment, excused themselves from the review, and were saluted by a Royal Marine band playing his national anthem. His blood-red royal standard streaming out of the masthead. How much King Amunallah heard of the music in the buffeting wind is hard to say, but he was certainly much more civil than Admiral Collard was when that admiral heard his band play. Huddled in his greatcoat, he was led aloft to a special viewing platform high above Nelson's conning tower. By now the weather had thickened, and visibility deteriorated, so the first event on the well-rehearsed programme, an attack by submarines on Nelson, had to be abandoned. Instead, 4 destroyers, streaming as fast as they dare, under the conditions, and already shipping green water over their upper decks, attempted a depth charge attack. Watching their plight, Nelson obligingly changed onto a more accommodating course. Even so, the thunder of the explosions was hardly heard above the weather. The sky was darkening all the time, and when the fleet steamed past Nelson, firing a 21-gun salute as they went, they could hardly be seen. Somewhere overhead, a flying boat had managed to locate the flagship and circled in homage. This was the only aircraft seen that day. A mock attack on Nelson by the carrier Furious had to be cancelled, as did the set piece of the day, the full-blooded target shooting of all the fleet's big guns. At around 6 o'clock that evening, the salt-stained, sea-steaming Atlantic fleet returned King Amunallah to the shelter of Spithead to put him aboard the Southern Railway's ferry paddle steamer, Duchess of Fife, also proudly wearing the Royal Afghan ensign. She chugged away to the sound of that marine band, once again playing Amunallah's national anthem. The King sent a message expressing his satisfaction, though whether it was at the Navy's hospitality or at the thought of approaching dry land again, it is hard to say. It was probably, and entirely, coincidental that a few days later His Majesty entered a Berlin nursing home for an operation on his tonsils. There must have been much to talk about in the wardroom of the Atlantic Fleet that stormy night. There would have been even more had communications made it possible for them to know the fate of a dispirited commander out in Gibraltar.